What would you do if your bosses fired you over lunch, thinking you were powerless? What if I told you that by the time dessert arrived, the girl they just dismissed had already destroyed their empire? Would you believe that a farm girl from Pine Hollow could outmaneuver corporate executives with decades of experience? This is the true story of how I, Jo Harper, turned a firing into a hostile takeover, all before the waiter brought the check. Pine Hollow wasn't the kind of place where dreams came true, it was where they came to die, rusting away like old farm equipment in forgotten barns. But Jo Harper wasn't most people. At 16, while other girls worried about prom dresses, she was elbow-deep in tractor engines, grease under her fingernails and fire in her eyes. Jo, that transmission ain't gonna fix itself, her daddy had called from the porch, watching her wrestle with machinery twice her size. She'd looked up, wrench in hand, determination carved into her young face. Neither will our books, Daddy. But I'll handle both. By 18, she'd balanced the farm's ledgers, modernized their equipment, and doubled their profit margins by streamlining crop rotation and negotiating better equipment leases. But Pine Hollow felt like a cage, and Jo Harper was born to soar. The day she turned 21, she packed everything she owned into a beat-up pickup truck and pointed it toward the city. Caldwell and Harrison Manufacturing towered against the skyline like a steel and glass promise. Jo stared up at its 40-story height, her reflection small in its mirrored windows. Little did the executives inside know that their biggest threat had just arrived, and she was wearing work boots. The Caldwell and Harrison lobby smelled like expensive coffee and broken promises. Jo's boots clicked against marble floors that cost more than most Pine Hollow families made in a year. She clutched her resume, knowing it looked thin compared to the Ivy League degrees decorating the walls. Junior logistics clerk position. The receptionist barely looked up, her manicured nails clicking against her keyboard. 20th floor. Ask for Patricia Vance. Jo's interview lasted exactly 12 minutes. Patricia Vance, a stern woman with silver hair pulled tight enough to lift her eyebrows, skimmed the single-page resume with visible disappointment. No college degree. No corporate experience. Just farm work and... She squinted. Tractor repair? Yes, ma'am. But I can fix anything that's broken. Patricia almost smiled. Almost. Well, Miss Harper, we'll see what breaks first, you or this job. The starting salary was barely enough to cover rent in a studio apartment that smelled like cigarettes and failed dreams. But Jo didn't come here for comfort. She came to learn, to watch, and to wait. On her first day, she discovered Caldwell and Harrison's biggest problem wasn't what they manufactured, it was how they managed everything else. Caldwell and Harrison's 20th floor buzzed with the controlled chaos of middle management. Jo's desk sat in the corner, close enough to hear conversations but far enough away that executives forgot she existed. Perfect positioning for someone who planned to learn everything. Her official job was tracking shipments and managing delivery schedules. Boring work that others avoided, including the weekly supplier payment reports that executives routinely ignored. But Jo saw patterns in the numbers that told stories executives were too proud to read. Another late payment to Riverside Components, she muttered, updating spreadsheets that nobody else bothered to check. Third one this quarter. Riverside manufactured critical circuit boards. Without them, Caldwell and Harrison's flagship manufacturing line would grind to a halt. Yet the company consistently paid them 30, 40, sometimes 60 days late. During lunch breaks, Jo made calls. Not about work, about business opportunities. She'd saved every penny from her farm work, and now she was learning where to invest it. Riverside Components, this is Jake Patterson. Mr. Patterson, my name's Jo Harper. I heard through the grapevine you might be looking for new investors. On the other end of the line, silence. Then curiosity. The first piece was about to fall into place. Harper Ridge Holdings didn't exist on Monday morning. By Friday afternoon, it was a registered investment company with Jo Harper as its managing director and 3 silent partners who trusted her instincts more than Morrison and Hartwell's management ever would. "You sure about this play?" asked Thomas Fitzgerald, a former Pine Hollow neighbor who'd made millions in agricultural investments and had been looking for high-yield opportunities outside farming. His voice crackled through the burner phone Jo used for Harper Ridge business. "Tommy, these idiots are bleeding suppliers dry while sitting on mountains of cash they waste on executive bonuses. When this house of cards falls, we'll own every critical piece they need to rebuild." Riverside Components was struggling. Despite Caldwell and Harrison's massive orders, the consistent late payments created cash flow problems that threatened their survival. Jake Patterson, the founder, was desperate enough to listen when Jo offered a solution. "We'll buy 49% equity, inject immediate capital, and modernize your operations," she'd explained over dinner at a truck stop diner. "All we ask is first right of refusal on new partnerships and priority scheduling for existing clients." Patterson signed that night. He didn't realize he'd just given Jo Harper control over Caldwell and Harrison's manufacturing future. But Riverside was just the beginning. 6 months into her employment at Caldwell and Harrison, Jo Harper had perfected the art of invisibility. Executives walked past her desk discussing confidential strategies, never noticing the farm girl with the notebook who remembered every word. Cromwell Steel's getting uppity about their contract renewal. CEO Richard Kemp had complained to his secretary, loud enough for half the floor to hear. "Carl thinks we should find cheaper suppliers." Cromwell Steel supplied the specialized alloys that gave Morrison and Hartwell's products their competitive edge. They'd been partners for 15 years, but lately, the relationship had soured over delayed payments and unrealistic price demands. Jo made a note. That afternoon, she placed another call. "Cromwell Steel, this is Dorothy Cromwell." "Mrs. Cromwell, this is Jo Harper from Harper Ridge Holdings. I believe we have mutual interests regarding your current supply contracts." Within 2 weeks, Harper Ridge Holdings owned 35% of Cromwell Steel. Dorothy Cromwell, the founder's daughter, was tired of fighting Morrison and Hartwell's financial games and welcomed Jo's investment with relief. "They think they're too big to fail," Dorothy had said, signing the partnership agreement. "But every empire falls eventually. When theirs does, we'll be ready." The web was taking shape, strand by invisible strand. Jo's official performance review came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Patricia Vance sat behind her desk, reading from a folder marked "Confidential," while Jo tried to look appropriately humble. "Your work has been exceptional," Patricia admitted grudgingly. "Error rates down 30% in your department. Delivery efficiency up 25%. Even Richard Kemp noticed." The CEO had noticed. That should have felt like victory, but Jo's instincts prickled with warning. "Thank you, ma'am. I just try to do my job well. Well enough that we're promoting you to Senior Logistics Coordinator. 15% raise, corner desk, and direct reporting to the Executive Committee." Jo smiled and shook Patricia's hand, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. The corner desk meant visibility. Executive Committee reporting meant scrutiny. And scrutiny was dangerous for someone building a shadow empire. That evening, she called an emergency meeting with her Harper Ridge Holdings partners. "They're pulling me closer to the center," she explained. "Either they suspect something, or they want to use me. Either way, we need to accelerate our timeline." Thomas Fitzgerald's voice carried new urgency. "How much more time do you need?" 6 months. Maybe less if I can get to their supplier contracts first." But Jo didn't know that Richard Kemp had already made his decision about her future. Richard Kemp's corner office occupied the entire 42nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made him feel like a king surveying his domain. This morning, those windows framed storm clouds gathering over the city, a fitting backdrop for the conversation about to unfold. "She's too good," CFO Carl Denton said, dropping a thick folder onto Kemp's polished oak desk. "Nobody improves logistics efficiency by 30% without knowing exactly what they're doing." Kemp flipped through Katie Jo's personnel file, frowning at the numbers. Saved the company $2 million in shipping costs. Identified and eliminated redundant vendor relationships. Streamlined inventory management systems that had been broken for years. Maybe she's just talented. Talented people ask for recognition. They want credit, promotions, corner offices. This girl keeps her head down and works miracles. That's not ambition, that's strategy. Denton pulled out his tablet, swiping to surveillance footage from the 20th floor. Watch her during board meetings. She's not taking notes about her work. She's documenting everything we say about suppliers, contracts, financial projections. She's building intelligence. Kemp studied the grainy video. Sure enough, Katie Jo's notebook filled with details that had nothing to do with logistics coordination. You think she's corporate espionage? I think she's something worse. I think she's smart. The two men stared at each other across the polished oak expanse, both reaching the same conclusion. Jo Harper had become a threat. Katie Jo felt the shift before she saw it. Executive conversations became quieter when she walked past. Meetings she'd previously been invited to observe suddenly happened behind closed doors. Even Patricia Vance, never warm but always professional, began treating her with suspicious distance. They know something, she told her reflection in the office bathroom mirror. Question is, how much? The answer came in the form of a casual conversation she overheard between Richard Kemp and his assistant. They thought she'd left for lunch, but Katie Jo had doubled back to grab her jacket. Hollingsworth's Bistro, Thursday at 1 o'clock, Kemp was saying. Make sure it's private. We need to handle the Harper situation delicately. The Harper situation. Katie Jo's blood ran cold. That evening, she worked late at her apartment, surrounded by documents, laptop screens, and burner phones. Harper Ridge Holdings now owned stakes in 7 critical Morrison and Hartwell suppliers, with acquisition deals pending on 4 more. But if they fired her before the web was complete? Tommy, we need to move fast. They're planning something. How fast? Thomas Fitzgerald's voice carried the tension she felt. Accelerate all pending acquisitions. Full ownership where possible, controlling interest where necessary. And Tommy? Start liquidating my other assets. If this goes sideways, I'll need every dollar for the final play. Through her apartment window, the city lights twinkled like stars. Soon, she'd either own a piece of that skyline or be driving back to Pine Hollow with nothing but bitter lessons and empty pockets. Thursday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth and crystalline clarity, the kind of weather that made everything look deceptively peaceful. Katie Jo dressed carefully, choosing her best professional outfit not for the lunch she knew was coming, but for the war she planned to finish. At her desk, she worked with unusual intensity, staying late to make calls on her burner phone away from prying eyes. Every email answered. Every shipment tracked. Every vendor relationship documented and transferred to her replacement files. She was cleaning house, preparing for a transition nobody else saw coming. Katie Jo? Patricia Vance stood beside her desk, looking uncomfortable. Richard and Carl want to see you in conference room A at 12:30. Pre-meeting before lunch, they said. Of course. I'll be there. Patricia lingered, as if she wanted to say something else. Finally, she managed, you've done good work here. Really good work. It sounded like an obituary. At 12:25, Katie Jo gathered her notebook, her purse, and her composure. Conference room A waited at the end of the hall like a glass-walled execution chamber. Through its transparent walls, she could see Richard Kemp and Carl Denton reviewing documents that undoubtedly contained her professional death sentence. She paused at the threshold, taking one last look at the 20th floor that had been her kingdom and her classroom. Time to graduate. Conference room A felt smaller than usual, with Richard Kemp's ego filling most of the available space. He sat at the head of the polished table, Carl Denton flanking him like a loyal attack dog. Both men wore expressions of practiced sincerity that didn't reach their eyes. "Katie Jo, thank you for joining us," Kemp began, his voice carrying the false warmth of a politician at election time. "Please, sit." She chose the chair directly across from them, back straight, hands folded. The power dynamic was deliberate, them against her, authority against subordinate. They expected intimidation. They got calculation. "We've been reviewing your performance metrics," Carl continued, sliding a folder across the table. "Impressive numbers. Truly impressive." Katie Jo glanced at the charts and graphs documenting her success. Every victory she'd achieved, every improvement she'd implemented, every reason they should keep her. Which meant they'd already decided to do the opposite. "We'd like to discuss your future with Morrison and Hartwell over lunch," Kemp said. "Hollingsworth's Bistro has a private dining room. More comfortable for sensitive conversations." Sensitive conversations. Corporate euphemism for career execution. "That sounds lovely," Katie Jo replied, her smile as authentic as theirs. "What time shall we meet?" 1 o'clock. "We'll have so much to discuss." They had no idea how right they were. Katie Jo had exactly 27 minutes between the conference room charade and lunch. She spent them like a general preparing for the battle that would define her war. First call. Thomas Fitzgerald. "It's happening. Hollingsworth's Bistro, 1 o'clock. Execute Phase 3 immediately." "All of it?" "Everything. We own 11 suppliers now, controlling stakes in 6 others. When I give the signal, cut them off completely. No shipments, no deliveries, no nothing." "Katie Jo, you sure about this?" "Once we pull this trigger, there's no going back." She thought about Pine Hollow, about fixing tractors and balancing books, about dreams deferred and promises broken. "I've never been more sure of anything." Second call, her lawyer, Patricia Wells. "The acquisition documents are signed?" "Good. And the board presentation is ready?" "Perfect." "No, I won't need you there. This is something I have to do myself." Third call, her bank. "I need to confirm the wire transfer went through." $700 million across the 3 investment vehicles? Excellent. "Yes, I know it's a lot of money spread across multiple SPVs. That's the point." By 12:55, Katie Jo Harper stood outside Hollingsworth's Bistro, smoothing her skirt and checking her phone one last time. 17 messages from suppliers confirming receipt of her instructions. 4 from attorneys confirming document filings. 1 from her daddy in Pine Hollow, "Proud of you, kiddo. Show them how we do things." She smiled, genuinely this time, and walked through the door. Hollingsworth's Bistro specialized in making rich people feel important. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over oak paneling and oil paintings of dead industrialists who probably would have admired what was about to unfold. The private dining room tucked away from curious eyes was where Morrison and Hartwell executives celebrated their biggest victories. Today, it would witness their greatest defeat. Richard Kemp and Carl Denton had already ordered wine, expensive wine, Katie Jo noted, probably charged to the company account. They rose when she entered, all smiles and gentleman's manners. "Katie Jo, you look lovely," Kemp said, pulling out her chair. "I took the liberty of ordering appetizers. Hope you don't mind." Not at all. This is quite nice. She settled into her seat, placing her purse beside her chair where her phone waited on silent mode, connected to a conference call with 11 supplier executives. They were listening to every word. Before we eat, Carl began, we wanted to discuss some exciting developments. Morrison and Hartwell is entering a new phase of growth. Restructuring. Modernization. Corporate speak for downsizing and layoffs. Jo nodded encouragingly while checking the time on her watch. 1:15, perfect timing. Sounds ambitious. How can I help? The two men exchanged glances. Richard cleared his throat. Well, that's just it, Jo. Your help won't be needed anymore. The envelope slid across white linen with the whisper of expensive paper against expensive cloth. Jo stared at it for a long moment, letting the weight of the gesture settle between them like a gauntlet thrown at her feet. Your severance package, Carl explained, his voice carrying the kind of false sympathy reserved for funerals and firing squads. Quite generous, actually. 6 months' salary, full benefits through the end of the year, and a glowing reference letter. Jo picked up the envelope, testing its weight. May I ask why? Restructuring, Richard said, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. Nothing personal. You've done excellent work, but we're moving in a new direction. Younger management. Fresh perspectives. Younger management. She was 26 years old. I appreciate the opportunity you gave me, Jo replied, tucking the envelope into her purse. Morrison and Hartwell taught me so much about business. You're taking this remarkably well, Carl observed, suspicion creeping into his voice. What's the point of getting upset? You've made your decision. She smiled, reaching for her water glass. Besides, I've learned that every ending is just a beginning in disguise. Richard raised his wine glass. To new beginnings, then. To new beginnings, Jo agreed, raising her water. Neither man noticed her other hand sliding her phone from her purse, finger hovering over a single text message, execute. The trap was set. Time to spring it. Dessert arrived with theatrical flourish, molten chocolate cake with gold leaf garnish, because subtlety had never been Hollingsworth's bistro's strength. Richard and Carl dug in with enthusiasm, their earlier tension dissolving into post-meal satisfaction and wine-fueled confidence. You know, Jo, Richard said between bites, you should be proud of your time with us. Not everyone can say they worked for Morrison and Hartwell. Some might even say it was the opportunity of a lifetime, Carl added, chuckling at his own cleverness. Jo pushed her cake around her plate, leaving artistic swirls. In the chocolate. You're absolutely right. It has been life-changing. Her phone buzzed against her leg. A text message from Thomas Fitzgerald, all systems ready. Awaiting your signal. She set down her fork and looked up at the two men who'd just destroyed her official career while unknowingly financing her unofficial empire. They'd gone back to their dessert, already dismissing her from their thoughts. Gentlemen, thank you for lunch. And thank you for the lesson. What lesson? Richard asked, not looking up from his cake. Jo smiled, lifted her phone, and sent the text. That in business, timing is everything. The message was simple, execute. By the time their spoons hit their plates, Morrison and Hartwell Manufacturing was about to discover what real power looked like. The first sign of catastrophe arrived in Carl Denton's pocket at exactly 2:47 p.m., just as he was savoring the last bite of his molten chocolate cake. His phone buzzed with an urgent text from Morrison and Hartwell's production manager. Riverside Components shipment failed to arrive. Production line down. Carl frowned, showing the message to Richard. Probably just a traffic delay. Jo sipped her coffee, watching their faces with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from her old desk. Clearly, chaos was already spreading through the 20th floor. Richard's phone rang. Then Carl's. Then both simultaneously. "Excuse me," Richard said, stepping away from the table. His voice carried back to them in increasingly agitated fragments. "What do you mean Cromwell's steel won't deliver?" They said what? "Find out what's happening." Carl's conversation was running similar territory. "All of our steel suppliers." The same message from everyone? This can't be a coincidence. Katie Jo checked her watch. 2:51 p.m. Right on schedule. Her phone buzzed with an update from Thomas Fitzgerald. Wave 1 complete. 11 suppliers confirmed shutdown. Production lines grinding to halt across 3 facilities. Wave 2 initiating now. She looked up at Richard, who was returning to the table with his face pale and his confidence shattered. "Everything all right?" she asked sweetly. Richard Kemp had built his career on the illusion of control. Corner office, executive privileges, the power to hire and fire at will. All symbols of a man who believed he commanded his own destiny. Now, watching his empire crumble in real time through urgent phone calls and panicked text messages, he was learning a harsh truth. Control had always been an illusion. Every supplier, he demanded into his phone, his voice echoing off Hollingsworth's private dining room walls. "That's impossible. Companies don't just coordinate like that without. He trailed off, his eyes finding Katie Jo across the table. She was stirring sugar into her coffee with maddening calm, seemingly oblivious to the corporate apocalypse unfolding around them. Carl had stepped outside, but his voice carried through the glass doors. "Stock prices dropping? How much? Jesus Christ. No, don't issue any statements until we understand what's happening." Katie Jo's phone buzzed again. Thomas Fitzgerald's text was brief. "Molten Industries acquired. Blackstone Materials acquired. Phase 2 complete. Ready for Phase 3. She set down her spoon and folded her hands. "Richard, you look troubled. Bad news from the office?" His eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about our suppliers suddenly refusing to fulfill contracts, would you?" "Why would I know anything about that? I just got fired, remember?" But there was something in her smile, confident, knowing, dangerous, that made his blood run cold. Carl Denton burst back through the dining room doors, his face flushed and his tie askew. In the space of 10 minutes, he'd aged 10 years. "Richard, we need to leave. Now. The board is calling an emergency meeting. Harper Industries just launched a hostile takeover bid." Katie Jo raised an eyebrow. "Morrison Industries? I've never heard of them." "Neither had we," Carl replied grimly. "They didn't exist this morning. But apparently, they now own controlling stakes in 15 of our critical suppliers, hold $700 million in cash, and just filed acquisition papers with the SEC. How is that possible?" Richard demanded. Katie Jo finished her coffee and dabbed her lips with her napkin. "Well, that is fascinating. Who runs Morrison Industries?" Carl consulted his phone. "Someone named Catherine J. Harper. Listed as founder and CEO." The silence that followed was so complete that Katie Jo could hear her own heartbeat. She watched recognition dawn on Richard's face like sunrise breaking over a cemetery, inevitable, illuminating, and somehow terrible. "Catherine J. Harper," Richard repeated slowly. "Katie Jo." She smiled, the same sweet smile she'd worn for 3 years while learning everything about their business, their weaknesses, their blind arrogance. "Hello, boys. I believe we have some business to discuss." "You. How did you? This is impossible." Katie Jo stood, smoothing her skirt. "Nothing's impossible. You just have to know which strings to pull." And thanks to working for you, I learned exactly where they all were. The emergency boardroom of Morrison and Hartwell Manufacturing had never felt so small. 12 directors sat around the polished oak conference table like generals planning a retreat, their faces grim as they absorbed the impossible reality of their situation. Jo Harper, former junior logistics clerk, recently fired employee, apparent mastermind, sat at the opposite end of the table with the calm confidence of someone who'd already won. Her attorneys flanked her like bookends, their briefcases full of acquisition documents and legal maneuvers. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Board Chairman Walter Brightwater said, his voice carrying the weight of his 70 years in business. You've been systematically purchasing our suppliers while working as our employee? Not purchasing, Jo corrected. Investing in. Supporting businesses that were struggling with cash flow problems largely caused by Morrison and Hartwell's payment practices. Richard Kemp sat halfway down the table, looking like he'd been hit by a freight train. This is corporate espionage. Industrial sabotage. We'll sue you into oblivion. Jo's lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Claire Fox, slid a folder across the table. My client's actions were completely legal. She identified undervalued companies, offered fair investments, and provided them with financial stability. If Morrison and Hartwell's business practices created those opportunities, that's hardly her fault. Carl Denton was frantically typing on his laptop. Our stock has dropped 40% in the last hour. Production is completely shut down. We can't fulfill any orders. Which brings us to our offer, Jo said. Jo opened her leather portfolio with the deliberate precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Inside, a single document waited, the culmination of 3 years of planning, 6 months of execution, and a lifetime of ambition. Harper Industries hereby offers to acquire Caldwell and Harrison Manufacturing for $12 per share. The boardroom erupted. $12 per share was 40% below yesterday's closing price, 60% below the company's peak value. It was an insult wrapped in legal language. Absolutely not, Walter Brightwater declared. This company is worth 3 times that amount. Was worth 3 times that amount, Jo corrected. Before your suppliers stopped delivering. Before your production lines shut down. Before your stock price crashed. Current fair market value is... well, exactly what I'm offering. She gestured toward the wall-mounted screens displaying real-time financial data. Morrison and Hartwell's stock continued its death spiral, hemorrhaging value with every passing minute. This is extortion, Richard accused. This is business, Jo replied. You taught me that. You also taught me that timing is everything, cash flow is king, and supplier relationships matter more than corner offices. Claire Fox distributed copies of the acquisition proposal. The offer includes full employment protection for all non-executive staff, continuation of existing benefit plans, and investment in facility modernization. And for executives? Carl asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Jo's smile was arctic. There will be restructuring. The grandfather clock in Morrison and Hartwell's boardroom chimed 4 o'clock, marking the beginning of what Jo privately called the final hour. Her acquisition offer came with a deadline: accept by 5 o'clock, or watch Morrison Industries withdraw the offer and let Morrison and Hartwell collapse under its own weight. This is madness, Walter Brightwater muttered, reviewing the proposal for the 4th time. 40 years I've been on this board. 40 years building this company. And 3 hours watching it crumble, Jo replied without malice. Mr. Brightwater, I respect what you've built here. That's why I want to save it. But I won't save the management practices that nearly destroyed it. Around the table, board members huddled in whispered conversations. Some glanced nervously at the stock ticker, watching their equity evaporate in real time. Others studied Jo with mixtures of admiration and horror. Richard Kemp sat in stunned silence, occasionally shaking his head like a man trying to wake from a nightmare. Carl Denton had stopped pretending to work and simply stared at his hands. "If we accept your offer," board member Patricia Whitmore asked, "what guarantees do we have about the company's future direction?" Katie Jo slid another document across the table. "My business plan. Supplier relationship rehabilitation, production line modernization, workforce development programs, and sustainable growth strategies. Everything Morrison and Hartwell should have been doing years ago." The clock chimed 4:30. Time was running out for more than just the company. Walter Brightwater called for the vote at 4:47 p.m., 13 minutes before Katie Jo's deadline expired. 12 board members sat around the polished oak table, each holding a ballot that would determine the fate of a company that had dominated their industry for 3 decades. All in favor of accepting Morrison Industries' acquisition offer? 7 hands rose slowly, reluctantly, like flags of surrender. 7 directors choosing survival over pride. Opposed? 3 hands. Richard Kemp's was not among them. He'd abstained, sitting motionless as his corporate life ended around him. 2 abstentions. The motion carries. Brightwater's voice carried the weight of defeat. "Morrison and Hartwell Manufacturing accepts your offer, Miss Harper." Katie Jo nodded once, professionally, though inside she felt the fierce satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally brought down her prey. "Thank you. The transition will begin immediately. My team will coordinate with your department heads to ensure minimal disruption." She stood, gathering her papers. Around the table, men and women who'd considered themselves corporate titans just hours ago were learning what it felt like to be outmaneuvered by someone they dismissed as insignificant. "One question," Richard said, speaking for the first time in an hour. His voice was hoarse, beaten. "Why? You had a good job. A future here. Why destroy everything?" Katie Jo paused at the door, considering her answer. When she spoke, her voice carried echoes of Pine Hollow, of nights spent fixing broken machines and balancing impossible budgets. Because you never understood what you had. And someone needed to save it from you. Monday morning brought a new nameplate to the 42nd floor corner office, Catherine J. Harper, Chief Executive Officer. The same windows that had once framed Richard Kemp's kingdom now overlooked Katie Jo's empire, though she planned to use the view differently than her predecessor. Her first executive meeting drew a crowd. Department heads who'd barely acknowledged her existence as a logistics clerk now hung on her every word. The transformation was complete, but not the way anyone had expected. "Our first priority is supplier relationship rehabilitation," she announced, standing at the head of the conference table where she'd once been fired. "I've already begun negotiations to restore delivery schedules and repair the trust we damaged through poor payment practices." Thomas Fitzgerald, now serving as Chief Financial Officer of the merged companies, outlined the financial restructuring. "We're implementing net 15 payment terms for all suppliers, establishing a supplier development fund, and creating profit-sharing agreements with key partners." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Katie Jo was using Morrison and Hartwell's own money to undo Morrison and Hartwell's mistakes. "What about executive positions?" asked Lauren Wells, former head of human resources. Katie Jo smiled. "There will be changes. We're promoting from within wherever possible. I believe in recognizing talent, regardless of where it comes from." She thought of Patricia Vance, now serving as Chief Operating Officer. Of Jake Patterson, whose Riverside Components partnership had become a model for all supplier relationships. Sometimes the best revenge was simply doing things right. 3 months later, Morrison Industries had become the success story that Morrison and Hartwell should have been years ago. Production lines hummed with efficiency, supplier relationships flourished, and employee morale reached levels not seen since the company's founding days. Katie Jo walked the factory floor every morning, talking with workers who remembered her as the girl who used to track their shipments. Now she was the CEO who learned their names, understood their challenges, and invested in their future. Ms. Harper, called Maria Rodriguez, a line supervisor with 15 years of experience. The new efficiency protocols are working great. We're ahead of schedule on the Peterson contract. Excellent work, Maria. How's the overtime situation? Much better since we hired those additional workers. Amazing what happens when you staff appropriately. Katie Jo smiled, making notes on her tablet. Revolutionary concepts, paying suppliers on time, staffing adequately, treating employees like humans rather than cost centers. Richard Kemp had never understood that sustainable business required sustainable relationships. Her phone buzzed with a message from Thomas Fitzgerald. Quarterly numbers are in. Revenue up 23%, profit margins up 18%, employee satisfaction at all-time high. Not bad for a farm girl from Pine Hollow. Through the factory windows, she could see the city skyline stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, Richard Kemp was probably applying for jobs at companies that wouldn't recognize his particular style of leadership. Carl Denton had taken early retirement, claiming he wanted to explore other opportunities. The corporate world was smaller than people imagined. Eventually, their paths would cross again. The letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, hand-delivered by messenger to Katie Jo's office. Expensive paper, elegant handwriting, the kind of formal correspondence that usually accompanied either congratulations or lawsuits. She recognized the return address, Brightwater and Associates, Walter Brightwater's consulting firm. Dear Miss Harper, it began, I wanted to personally congratulate you on Morrison Industries' remarkable first-year performance. What you've accomplished in 12 months exceeded most predictions, including my own. Katie Jo leaned back in her chair, reading the rest of Brightwater's letter. He was offering his services as a senior advisor, bringing 40 years of industry experience to help guide Morrison Industries' continued expansion. It was a generous offer from a man who could have held grudges. Walter Brightwater understood what Richard Kemp never had, that business was about building, not just conquering. Her assistant knocked on the door. Miss Harper? There's someone here to see you. Says it's personal. Katie Jo looked up from the letter. Who is it? Richard Kemp. The name hit her like a physical blow. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she hadn't expected it so soon. After everything that had happened, what could he possibly want to discuss? Send him in. She set Brightwater's letter aside and straightened her shoulders. Whatever Richard Kemp wanted, she was ready for it. She'd been preparing for this conversation since that lunch at Hollingsworth's bistro. Time to close the circle once and for all. Richard Kemp looked older than his 58 years as he entered Katie Jo's office. The tailored suits had been replaced with off-the-rack clothing, the executive confidence with something approaching humility. He stood awkwardly near the door, uncertain of his welcome. Richard. Please, sit down. He chose the chair across from her desk. The same position she'd once occupied as a subordinate seeking approval. The irony of role reversal wasn't lost on either of them. I know you have no reason to see me, he began, his voice lacking its former authority. But I needed to say something. Katie Jo waited, her expression neutral. You were right. About the suppliers, the payment terms, the way we treated people. I spent so many years focused on quarterly profits that I forgot business is really about relationships. He paused, struggling with words. What you've built here, it's what Morrison and Hartwell should have been. Is that an apology? It's an admission. And maybe a request for advice. Katie Jo studied his face, seeing genuine remorse where once there had been only arrogance. What kind of advice? I'm starting over. Consulting work, small projects. Learning to build instead of just manage. He managed a rueful smile. Think a corporate dinosaur can learn new tricks? She thought of her daddy's advice about second chances, about Pine Hollow's belief that anyone could change if they truly wanted to. Everyone deserves the opportunity to do better, Richard. The question is whether you're willing to do the work. He nodded, standing to leave. At the door, he turned back. Katie Jo? That girl who sat in my office 3 years ago, asking for a chance. She was extraordinary. I was just too blind to see it. After he left, Katie Jo sat alone in the silence of her corner office, looking out at the city that had once seemed impossible to conquer. Pine Hollow felt like a lifetime ago, but its lessons remained. Work hard, treat people fairly, and sometimes the best revenge is simply proving them wrong. Outside her window, the sun was setting over her empire, built not on destruction, but on the simple revolutionary concept of doing business the right way.